Okay, hello to everybody who has dialed in today. My name is Phoebe Ewan and I am the Programme Director at the Mekong Club. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by Labour Solutions, which is an organisation dedicated to developing technology and advisory services to advance human rights throughout global supply chains. We're joined today by Elena, who is CEO and co-founder, and Sophie, who is the Senior Director of Worker Engagement. Thank you both for joining today. Just a reminder to everybody on the line, please keep your lines on mute while the speakers are going through their session. But feel free to pop any questions into the chat function at the bottom of your screens. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session today. Before I hand over to Sophie and Elena, I would like to first quickly introduce the Mekong Club for those of you on the call who might be new to our work. So we're a Hong Kong-based NGO that's focused squarely on addressing modern slavery through positive and collaborative private sector engagement. We have a membership-based model and we welcome many of our members on the line today. By joining the Mekong Club, as a member, companies gain access to a range of tools and resources, one-on-one consultations, support in developing policies and procedures all related to modern slavery, help to understand and comply with modern slavery legislation, assessments of their anti-slavery strategies, as well as access to our working groups of like-minded professionals spanning across many multiple different industries. So our members consist of companies across financial services, hospitality, retail, manufacturing, technology, pharmaceuticals, and many other industries. And the operations and supply chains of our members really span across the globe. As part of our work, we look and to back up the kind of recommendations that we make, we aim to identify the very best and brightest initiatives and tools out there and build partnerships to help our members address modern slavery and related issues. So when a company joins the Mekong Club as a member, we take them through a comprehensive and confidential self-assessment that we call the baseline assessment. And that really breaks down the entire anti-slavery strategy of an organization. It helps us to identify gaps and identify opportunities to implement new tools and resources that we've identified and developed, and also helps companies to roadmap their work, set KPIs, and essentially move towards the ultimate goal of becoming industry leaders in this space. Now, a comprehensive modern slavery strategy for any company really includes many different elements. So ranging from policy development, training, due diligence and risk mapping, through to tracing supply chains and even reporting under ESG. We've been spotlighting these various different elements and the tools related to them throughout our webinars. And these areas are all very common topics of conversation and debate amongst our membership. So today we are talking about a crucial part of any modern slavery strategy, and that is grievance, or grievance mechanisms, whereby workers are able to voice their concerns and feedback on their labour conditions safely and securely. Now, I'm going to leave it to Sophie and Elena as the experts to get into the ins and outs of what makes up an effective grievance mechanism. But certainly, I'd like to highlight first the fact that this element of a modern slavery strategy is becoming increasingly important for many different reasons. Grievance is really being singled out in legislation as a crucial measure that companies need to be implementing, and they also need to be reporting the data that they're receiving from. Grievance is increasingly considered to be an important part of ESG. Access to and use of a grievance tool is something that can actually be measured and reported on in a tangible way to demonstrate that a company is taking action when it comes to modern slavery. Consumers and investors and legislators are all really pushing companies to move away from static approaches to grievance, and they're expecting organizations to be implementing something that's proven to work and something that workers genuinely do use. Now, despite this fact, we see that many organizations are only just starting out on putting together a grievance mechanism, or maybe now they're starting to take a look at the mechanism that they have and questioning whether it works. In fact, we conducted a survey of 150 or so anonymous professionals within our supply chain network, and we found that less than 50% of those felt that workers in the supply chain of their company are able to easily report concerns about their employment conditions in their own language in a safe and confidential manner. So fortunately, we are joined by Labour Solutions today to help demystify grievance mechanisms. I really encourage you to take this chance to ask any and every question that you may have by writing into the chat. As I mentioned, we are going to have plenty of time for a Q&A session at the end. So with that, thank you again, Sophie and Elena, for joining us today, and I will pass over to you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thanks for the great introduction. I will start us off and kind of welcome everybody again. We're really happy to be here with the Mekong Club today and walk you through grievance lines and what the best grievance lines are, and kind of set the scene for why that's important today, and talk to you about what tangible next steps you as a company can take to either get your suppliers compliant with grievance lines and have strong grievance lines, or for you as a company to have strong grievance lines. So just to start, Phoebe gave us a great introduction for what we do, but Labour Solutions is a technology company that has been around for almost a decade now. We actively serve 1.5 million workers globally. Many of them using some of our grievance line tools. We're in 23 countries and counting. Every quarter we're adding more countries, and every quarter we're adding more languages. We are uniquely positioned as a social enterprise, and so we're really focused on our impact before our business performance, but we're also focused on how do we make sure that we create sustainable solutions that are solution driven and solution forward. We'll get more kind of into our work as we go along, and please feel free to reach out and to either Sophie or I and check out our website page. With that, I will kind of punt it over to Sophie and let her get us started.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks, Phoebe, for the warm welcome, and to Kat and Matt as well for welcoming Labour Solutions today. I'd like to talk about the S in ESG and what it has to do with grievance. So I'm sure you have all heard the phrase ESG a lot, and even more so the S in ESG over the past couple of months, noticing how it's growing in popularity, but unfortunately not in clarity. By this, I mean it's increasingly important for ESG standards to be met by companies, but what these standards are and uniform bodies to regulate these standards have yet to be set up. So we're kind of in this in-between phase where the S in ESG is being defined. As of now, S in ESG standards can refer to ethical supply chains, diversity, equity, and inclusion, effective policies protecting against sexual misconduct, fair wages, the outreach programs that you and your company are able to do on the weekends, et cetera. So it's a really broad gambit, but clarity is finally coming to what the S in ESG means in supply chains with the wave of human rights due diligence laws. So as we can see on this slide, HRDD is becoming a prerequisite globally for doing business. The past year and a half have been landmark years for HRDD globally in all the countries that you see on this slide and more. Countries are now making it mandatory practice for human rights to be upheld in their supply chains for the workers that are part of the supply chains. Identify adverse impacts and actually go steps further beyond just identifying risks, mitigating violations, remediating them, and providing tangible reports that show data and change over time in not just their own businesses, but throughout their supply chain. So many of you on this call today work in companies with very large, very complex supply chains across the world. It's really in these outer tiers where human rights due diligence can have the most impact. So when we think about what traditional tools have been available for human rights risk assessments, they haven't always been sufficient or scalable to reach the scale of all of these businesses, as well as smaller social enterprises or small and medium enterprises, right? So in the past, the focus has been placed on the first half of the cycle I showed in the previous slide, on identifying risks and removing them through processes like audits in factory supply chains, which we all know well. However, these new laws are actually mandating going those extra steps and completing that cycle to mandate active remediation and tangible evidence that prevention efforts have been done. These laws are, in conclusion, demanding this shift from do these issues even exist to are there quality systems in place to be able to address and remediate these issues. And so with this, we propose that successful and scalable solutions to HRDD that tie in that ambiguous S from ESG include direct worker reporting and mandate supplier ownership. So throughout this presentation, we'll show you why we believe those two things are crucial. First off, because this challenge is impossibly large for multinational companies to solve on their own. But a legal mandate now means it's the supplier's legal obligation to be able to remediate grievances and issues as they arise. So a legal mandate looks great on paper and is very difficult to implement in practice, as many of you know. Almost all of these laws are requiring a system to make that practice happen. And the system is being referred to as a grievance or complaints mechanism. So I'm going to get a little bit more into what this looks like. But first, I'll have Elena talk about some of the buzzwords that are happening in the industry and kind of break down the jargon a bit before we get into how we can make this work for your business.
Thanks, Sophie. As we know, if you're in this industry at all, there's tons of words that are flying around to describe worker engagement, worker voice, helplines, grievance lines. What do they all mean? They are all over the place, and there is a lot of trends around adding this to our programs, our sustainability programs, our supplier outreach programs. But in essence, they're all after the same thing. They all have the same objective, which is how do we effectively include workers in the process of improving their workplace, of making their workplace a better place to be. And we want to include them in this improvement conversation because leaving them out is an ineffective strategy to get towards sustainable change. But today we are talking about grievance lines, so we want to make sure that we go ahead and define that for everybody before we kind of go forward. So a grievance mechanism, I'm going to read the definition, and I know it's super complicated, and we're going to break that all down. But a grievance mechanism is a procedure that provides a clear and transparent framework for addressing grievances related to the recruitment process and within the workplace. This typically takes form of an internal procedure for complaints, followed by consideration and management response and feedback. So it's an ongoing process, which is a really important thing to remember. This is not it's not a grievance box. It's not a complaints box. It's not a hotline that doesn't have a return of that. It's very important that we close the loop, and we'll talk about that going forward. Good grievance systems are really important, and they build trust between workers and their employers via transparent communication. And that is a really important thing to remember when we think about what a grievance line is and what it should be. So grievance lines have essentially two really strong stakeholders: a worker and the employer. There are a lot of other stakeholders in our space, and we want to make sure that we define what everybody's roles and responsibilities are when we talk about grievance lines and how we go forward to ensure that we start with a foundational understanding that sets us up for success. So again, a grievance line really should be between a worker and their employer, and the employer should own the remediation and the communication, and the worker should own the reporting. However, we know the world isn't perfect. We know that there are plenty of instances where this relationship has broken down, and that's why we have other stakeholders whose job is to support this relationship. So, oftentimes we find that we have third parties like NGOs and other local stakeholders, and their job has really become to advocate and support and amplify what workers are saying. Sometimes they may take over that communication, but still the job of remediating still belongs to the employer. Then we have buyers, like a lot of you guys that are on this call, brands, retailers, other people like that. The job of a retailer isn't to remediate the issue from the worker. It is to set clear standards about what your expectations are, and then to support your vendors to achieve these standards. So that may be through providing them with effective grievance mechanisms or training. That may be through making sure that they actually have effective grievance mechanisms. But again, the relationship that we're trying to support here is workers and employers. And obviously government plays a role in all of this. They set and enforce rules and regulations, and we need to be very clear that nobody, this call and the stakeholders we're talking about on this call are not government officials, right? Government obviously has its own grievance mechanism process and procedures and court proceedings and things like that. And that's really important that when somebody breaks a law that we go to governments. However, as we know, that doesn't always work. And that's why we have these other supporting mechanisms. So when we talk about the fact that there are two really important stakeholders within a grievance mechanism, we need to view the grievance mechanism from each of those stakeholders' point of view to understand what needs to happen for it to be successful. So first, we'll take it from a worker's perspective. The first and foremost thing that must happen for a grievance mechanism to work for a worker is for them to know about it and for it to be accessible. So we can't have an email address that is posted on a brand's website page somewhere that a worker doesn't know about as an accessible starting point. The second and really probably one of the most important pieces of this is that there has to be respect and promptness that is associated with any grievance. So no matter what a worker brings forward, whether it be about the toilet or whether it be about forced labor or whether it be about food or whether it be about underage working, each worker deserves to be treated with respect and kindness and have follow through with what they said. The reason that's so important is that's how we build trust. So if a worker doesn't believe that you can handle the most simple part of their life or their basic humanity, what they eat, how they get to work, how they use the restroom, if they don't believe that you can settle those things, there's no way they're going to tell you about something else, right? So trust is really important, and showing respect and kindness throughout the process is key. The second thing is there has to be a transparent process. Workers need to know, so what? What's going to happen? Who gets this grievance? Who receives it? Who are they? What will they do? How will they respond? Is there an investigation? There's lots of questions and pieces to that workers need to know, because oftentimes when a worker is raising a complaint, they're already in a state of incredible vulnerability. So it's really important that one of the first things we do with grievance lines is tell a worker, here are the next steps that are going to happen based on what you said, after they submit it and before they submit it, to make sure that the cycle is complete. The next thing is there has to be follow through. So oftentimes we see the grievance lines are really ineffective because the worker doesn't know anything that happened. So when I first got into this industry in 2013, I did a trip to Malaysia and worked with 25 different factories in Malaysia. And it was really enlightening because one of the things we found was that almost every single factory that we talked to had a process. Every single factory that we talked to had a system, but they had no ability to follow through. So they were working, they were like ducks, they were paddling and working so hard to fix these things on behalf of workers, but they never had the ability to tell a worker what they did. As a result, over 90% of workers within the factories that we went to did not know they had a helpline, didn't know they had a grievance line. And that's because there was no follow through. They didn't trust it. So it's so important that we tell workers what we do, even if we don't solve the problem that they think they have. And then all of that leads to an engaged workforce. And this is a cycle. These things continue to happen. So it goes really well for me. I hear back, I feel respected, I trust it. I tell Sophie. Sophie then may tell more, right? I now understand the process. These things build on each other. It's a cycle. It has to continue to work. So this is what we look for when we think about it from a worker's perspective. Does the system work? The other people we need to think about, the other big stakeholders here, are employers. Do employers trust the system, right? Because employers are, at the end of the day, the legal responsibility to remediate the issues belongs to them. If we want to create sustainable change, it starts by encouraging employers to do the right thing, right? Because we are talking about these very complex supply chains. There is no way that a complex supply chain leader, so somebody at the top of that chain, is able to remediate every problem throughout your supply chain. You can't. What you can do is set up incentives that allow employers to manage them themselves and provide the support they need to be successful. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, employers have to see the system as work. I have to tell you, I've been to so many factories where people are like, I don't need a grievance system. I have a box. Nobody uses it. I don't need a system. Nobody uses my grievance line. I'm sure many people on this call have grievance lines that don't get any hits. They don't get any calls. They don't get any messages, whatever it may be. That's because something else is broken, right? The next thing is that they need to be able to easily gather more information. So this is a great example of how a box in a facility does not work. The reason that doesn't work is because if somebody drops a message into or a note into one of these boxes and they say, "Dear Sophie's factory, my manager hit me." What is Sophie supposed to do about that? Sophie doesn't know where it happened, when it happened, what happened. Sophie can't follow up. Even if Sophie investigates it, Sophie can't even tell the worker what they did, but it sets Sophie up to fail from the beginning. So we need to make sure that our systems that we implement enable us to have two-way communication. Because again, workers who are using these systems are oftentimes starting from a place of vulnerability and are unlikely to give us all the information that is needed from the start. They also need to be able to gather data. So how do we understand what workers' needs are at a meta level, right? How do we see trends? How do we understand how this changes what we're doing well or not doing well as an employer? So are we getting lots of messages from one department or from one area where we might have a bad manager? How do I use this data to improve my employment practices, to improve my facility? That's a really important component to any kind of tool that we provide employers. But the most important part of all of this is employer ownership and trust. So since our industry has for a long time been set up as a buyer push down system where we don't trust suppliers and we don't trust employers, what ends up happening is the employer is incentivized to not bring to light any issue, even if the employer wants to fix the issue. So that means that an employer might know that something bad, like forced labor, happened in their recruitment process. The employer may not have the skills, or they may have the skills to fix that issue, but they're incentivized to tell workers not to tell them about it. They're incentivized to tell workers not to bring it up. And workers continue in their cycle of vulnerability. And so it's really important. One of the most important things that buyers can do is to trust employers, is to give them ownership of this process. These are their employees. There's no way we can do this at huge scale without trusting employers first. Really, really important component of it. And then that enables us to make change, right? Because when we're able to admit our flaws, when we're able, just as we are as individuals, as humans, companies are the same. When we are given a space of trust where we feel like we have the space to make mistakes and make changes, then change happens. So if an employer is able to do that and see change, then they'll have a more engaged workforce and they'll have an increased bottom line. Also, they'll be in compliance with the law, which is the really big pro here. So it's really important, again, that this is a cycle. And so for a grievance system to really work, it really has to be a complete cycle of both of these things. And so the first part of this requires the right tool. And the second part of this requires the right process and incentive. And some of that starts with you as a buyer, and some of that is set by the employer themselves. And all of this is only achieved if we have all of these things working in tandem together. So we need to think about what grievance systems we have out there. So I'm going to pass it back to Sophie to talk about the now what. How do I put this into practice as a buyer? What are my next steps?
Thanks, Elena. So going back to that cycle of, you have workers trusting the system, you have suppliers trusting the system. Overall, how do you assess if and how a system is effective? I think for next steps, you really have to make sure you tomorrow can build trust, support your suppliers in setting up these effective processes and tools to really complete that ecosystem and make sure that you're including ownership for suppliers while elevating the voices of workers. The things you can do here are setting standards. You need to be clear. You can set clear guidelines and expectations for what suppliers need to do and how to manage these processes. Be clear about the type of data as well that you want and how that data will be used. So not just collecting data for the sake of it or reporting on it, actionable data that again gets back to the earlier piece from the S and ESG and HRDD of actually remediating problems as they arise. You have to be clear as well about how you measure success so that suppliers are empowered not just to act because you said so, but to track their changes over time and to see how they become increasingly compliant with these changing laws.
And to add to that really quickly,
Yeah.
sorry, Sophie, to add to that, the output of all of these systems is usage. Are people using the system? When they're not using the systems, we know they don't work. And that's the output we're looking for. Sorry, Sophie, go ahead.
Absolutely. And I think that leads nicely into the point of building that trust, because if suppliers know that the system's being used and workers know it's being used, there's an understanding for both parties that the other trusts each other. So there's really a mutual understanding that can create a better work culture and prevent issues like modern slavery and forced labor. You can support successes as well. This isn't all about logging complaints or grievances. You can be providing case studies and examples to suppliers of effective grievance mechanisms and ways that workers as well can raise positive change that they've seen observed in their facilities. You can provide resources and e-learnings, so incentivizing workers and managers as well to understand how and why grievance is important for them and when and how they should report as well. And as long as your job is to support the supplier, support their workers, you can take that through all of these other processes, including providing access to existing tools that meet your standards and opportunities for reflection and self-evaluation for both workers and supplier management in the form of worker surveys, as well as self-assessment questionnaires to periodically address and evaluate the efficacy of the system and hear it from the people that are actually using it. You also need some time to access and enforce the system. Or assess it rather, understanding how and if utilization is actually happening in the system. From there, you can also be collecting live and actionable data. So not just a periodic review with an audit or a worker survey, but live visibility on the types of grievances and channels and questions that are coming through. So it's really a combination of steps, including setting standards, supporting existing successes, and assessing and enforcing data that will allow you to build a process and a tool that's really holistic and involves suppliers and workers as well on grievance. The reason that we suggest not a one-size-fits-all solution, but a multi-pronged approach for grievance is because complex supply chains demand it. Each approach that we use can and should as well uphold best practice principles. So why can't grievance just be a tick box or a one-size-fits-all or the question box that Elena was mentioning earlier in a corner of a factory? It's because in reality, many of you on this call have a lot of different complex supply chains that make up your flow of goods and services that you provide. So in many cases, there are existing grievance lines that work really well at scale. There's the Accord in Bangladesh, highly localized or geographically specific solutions that offer NGO support. Finding good grievance isn't about disarming those successful systems. It's about empowering those systems to continue and find gaps where they exist in the grievance process and address those with alternatives. So it's really about keeping the focus, as is shown in this graphic, on supplier-owned questions from workers and responses, bridging that out into geographically specific or NGO-owned remediation and support, and integrating that into existing systems. So there are also effective industry-based hotlines that provide coverage, but it's really a gap that exists in grievance to get to all those other parts of the supply chain that aren't included here. So that could be this tier 2 suppliers of complex supply chain for commodities. And you really need some grievance solution to get there, not just because it's required under the law, but because the concerns at that tier of supply chains need to be addressed in a much more proactive way than they have been in the past. So going forward, sorry, Elena, I wasn't sure if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
No, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that we really believe in that a multi-pronged approach is going to be important for some people on this call. It won't be the solution for everybody. Like, we believe that employer-owned with oversight grievance mechanisms are the best. There's also a true need for community-based grievance systems, for industry-based grievance systems. We look at really specific situations, and there are some great ones that are out there, and we shouldn't try to replicate where things already exist. And that's partly because we have to remember the first thing that has to be true about these grievance lines is they have to be known and accessible to workers. And so to continue to make things up when there already is something is not a great strategy in making sure that workers know about it. However, we recognize that there is a huge gap, and there's a lot of gaps around the industry. And so that's why we partnered with the Mekong Club to create a grievance line that will work on filling that gap. So when you map out what your different grievance lines are and what you have, we'll work together to fill in those gaps by using our new grievance line that is being announced now and will be fully unveiled in the coming weeks and as we talk to more stakeholders. Sophie, do you want to talk more about it?
Absolutely. Yeah, Elena. So to Elena's points as well about not reinventing the wheel with a lot of alternative solutions for grievance, we believe we're combining our already successful approaches on grievance to create a solution that can work and is very flexible and agile for these multi-pronged approaches, as well as for single stream approaches. So we have an education forward approach where we're able to use data from our e-learning systems to ensure that workers and suppliers actually know about the line. We've designed a structure that's suitable for these large and fluctuating supplier networks, which many of you might have on this call, something that's multilingual that actually engages workers and managers in their native languages and empowers that supplier-owned remediation. So it is available 24/7, but again, puts the onus of the second half of the HRDD circle of grievance management and remediation back on the suppliers. And so it also will provide a list of needs improvement suppliers so that everybody you would have kind of access to seeing how suppliers are doing as well. So again, we're in the early stages of this collaboration. We'd love to hear more from you about your concerns and thoughts on this. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Phoebe at this stage.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, so for those of you on the line who are Mekong Club members, we're very much looking forward to showing and telling you more about this new collaboration in the coming weeks, and we'll certainly be getting your input into how this will be looking. Very, very exciting. More broadly, I would like to remind everybody to please pop any questions that you have for the speakers into the chat. We have deliberately left a good chunk of time now at the end of this session to dive a little bit deeper into the specifics of grievance and respond to the particular needs and questions that you guys have. So please feel free to put your questions into the chat and we will make sure we get through all of them now. So yeah, maybe if you guys want to stop sharing your screen. I have a couple of questions that have come to me directly already.
Yeah, so I have a question that came to me as well. Maybe, sorry, Phoebe.
Sorry, go ahead.
One thing about unions, and I want to clear that up really quickly, which is that in our viewpoint, unions and workers are the same, right? So unions represent workers, and that's very different than an NGO, right? NGO does not directly represent workers. That workers could also be worker committees. There's other ways for workers to work together to talk to their employer, but that those are synonymous in this analogy. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead, Phoebe. What were your other questions?
No worries. No, I mean, the first question is one that we get a lot, a lot, whenever we're talking about grievance. And it usually comes from, our partners who may be large multinationals with very expansive supply chains. We're talking thousands of first tier suppliers, let alone their suppliers and so on and so forth. And their questions tend to be around practicality. How on earth do you go about implementing an effective grievance mechanism in a meaningful way when you're talking about, potentially tens of thousands of factories within those supply chains?
I mean, that's a great question, and you know, one that we obviously expected and we see all the time as well. And we think that there's two ways for you to start. Number one is, like we said, it's about setting the right standards. It's about setting the right incentive. And that is something that's really easy for big companies to do at a high level, and that is totally scalable, right? So first start by, what are you looking for? What do you want? How do you measure success? And then providing the right tools to make sure that success happens. And so we want to make sure that we first focus on that. And there's some great tools out there, including one that Labor Solutions has, that really help you get that data back. But there's also some really great tools out there as well that help you tell your suppliers what a good grievance mechanism system looks like. When we speak about scalability, this is, you know, scalability is one of the biggest reasons that it has to be owned by the employer directly. And so that's because, you know, and anybody who's run a grievance line will tell you this, right? You're sitting in New York or Paris and you get a message from a worker in Bangladesh who says that their fire exit is blocked, right? What are you going to do about that? And you are coming from Paris, right? Whereas if we skip that and we go directly to the employer first, what we do is we enable really quick solutions and things that could become huge danger points, huge risk, and huge, you know, bigger issues, right? They could become things that workers get upset about over time. It's fixed really quickly. And so when we talk about scalability, we really have to talk about spreading it out. The other piece is that we know that you guys do have really complex supply chains, right? And so in some cases, this is not going to work, right? It's not going to be enough just to tell suppliers what you expect, right? You know that workers are not, that the culture in those workplaces is not mature enough to run their own grievance systems. And so that's when we look at community-based, industry-based groups that are out there doing incredible work already to help support these workers. Because again, workers, the fundamental bottom line of all of this is trust, right? A worker doesn't trust you as a random brand who is like 10 layers above them because they don't know who you are. So they don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know what's going to go through. And so these local and industry level grievance lines are really important for that. And that's also why when we look at how do we make this scalable from our point of view and how do we help you fill the gaps of where those things are not working, we start with e-learning. So we start with telling workers, first and foremost, what their rights and responsibilities are. We also want to make sure that we tell managers and employers what their rights and responsibilities are. And then through that process, what you can do is that you, as you hand out this e-learning throughout your supply chain, you are then able to track and make sure which percentage of your supply chain has received this e-learning. And then at the end of the e-learning, they're also given the tools they need, access to our helpline, to be able to access and talk to it. And then on our side, again, we're not punting that up to you as a brand. What we're doing is we're trying to remediate the problem with the employer first. How does that make it scalable and important to you? Well, because you're changing suppliers all the time, right? So you may not have any leverage over this particular supplier or a particular employer. But as a group together, as an industry together, we do have a little bit of power on it by being able to list them as a needs improvement supplier. So when we can no longer, you know, we've reached all the ends of every line of our ability to help and support them and get them to the next place, then we place them on a list of needs improvement, and then we know they have a problem, but that responsibility doesn't lie with the brand. So that's kind of how we're working on it. And then I guess I would just end by saying it's not easy, right? Like it shouldn't be, right? Like if it's easy, you're doing something wrong, right? This needs to be complex in order to really, I mean, when you're talking about complex supply chains, really including workers in the process is not easy, and it shouldn't be. And so we're here to help you and make it easy and make it easier, but know that this is gonna be work.
Sophie,
and I think to that, I would just add, Phoebe, if that's all right. One more point, which is just that, although yes, it's extremely, you know, a lot of work will be required by all actors to build that trust. There has also never been a more open time in history for grievance to actually function in the way that it was meant to, combined with already successful approaches that we've seen to localized grievance mechanisms, combined with a legal imperative from European countries, like most of them, especially Germany, to make this possible, combined with the ESG reporting metrics still being ambiguously defined, but focusing on ethical suppliers. All of these factors have never coalesced at the same time before. And we are in a unique position where we have been, as a company, operating for 9 years, and supply, sort of sustainability as a sector has been operating for about 25 or 30 years. So we have enough experience to know what works and to actually implement something that might make change in a way that it couldn't have before. And we have organizations like the Mekong Club, who are subject matter experts and specialized in figuring out what remediation would make sense, et cetera, and what type of follow-up is needed and all of that. So you have this kind of universal process that helps.
Thanks, Sophie. I guess from a Mekong Club perspective, we have a really amazing and diverse community of brands and partners that we're hoping to mobilize on this. So we're very excited about this collaboration because it offers us the opportunity to try things out together. And organizations that choose to join this won't be going out there on their own trying to implement. We'll be learning from each other, and we'll be kind of supporting each other in that process. So that's really, really exciting. Great question from Roger, who asks, okay, so the recommendations being made here are great for those companies that are very willing to get involved in grievance, but how do we reach workers within these supply chains or working for entities that maybe are less willing? They may be making money from the process of exploitation, or kind of willingly turning a blind eye. How do we work together to reach those workers in particular that may be more at risk?
Yeah, so I think, again, Roger, some of the same things we just talked about, which is first and foremost that the only way to really reach those workers is through local networks, and really building robust and supporting robust local networks that exist. And there are some really great ones out there in specific sectors and specific geographical locations that are really important to this kind of problem. It's also about supporting governments, right? Governments need to be supported to do their job, right? Taking advantage of workers should, and in most cases is, illegal. Now, is it always enforced? Is it policed? Is it all of the things that need to exist to make it happen? No. But where can your energy really be put effectively? It's about building up those robust systems as well. And then finally, I think it is about considering who do we source from, right? So how do we work with, and it's not always an option, right? I understand there are certain commodities that come from certain places, but in general, I think we need to think about what do we value, right? What are our values, and how do we show that through our supply chain? And I think that's really what the German Supply Chain Act is about. It's about making sure that everybody in your supply chain just knows what you stand for. And so, while that might be a complex financial decision to make, it is still one that is being begged to be made, right? So I think that there's a few pieces there. And then to Sophie's point, which she just really eloquently said, for the first time, it's legally required, right? And so the way we would identify this is when you look at your supply chain and you see that somebody has 0 grievances coming in, they have 0 messages coming in, we know there's an issue there, right? We immediately can identify that supplier isn't doing something right because workers don't trust them. So it's not a straightforward answer, but it's definitely not a straightforward supply chain. Sophie, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you said it really well. And I think the one thing I would add is there's always going to be corruption or a level of people who are trying to get around the law in any law that's ever passed. So it's more about understanding the maximum that we can do as a sector to empower suppliers to support their workforce. And I think that can happen through, as we've mentioned, disseminating educational materials and making sure everyone has access to the same information that they need to understand what they have to do and what conditions to look out for, and really try to enforce that. I think the personalization of technology, being able to access individual workers on their own devices and make sure that they have voices that can be elevated directly up to whomever their supervisor is a really important advent, but obviously not the entire solution. So it's really about leveraging the advances that we have in the law and in technology to access people on the margins, and also just giving the maximum amount of information that we can to suppliers, businesses, and managers so that everyone knows what they have to do. Corruption will always try to snake in. We just have to do our best to stop it as much as we can.
Yeah, and I mean, Roger, I see that Sophie just spoke exactly to the point that you just said, right? Which is, you know, it doesn't work everywhere. And that's the point, right? That's why you have a multi-pronged approach. You cannot rely on one thing. You have to rely on several different strategies to get there. I think the final thing that I would kind of say as well is that we're less concerned with individual issues and more concerned with systematic problems, right? So where do the systems not work? And that, you know, in some cases, to Roger's point, is the whole government, right? But we can build systems that work and make sure that workers have the ability to give their feedback where needed. Because Sophie is right, corruption is always going to leak in, but also there's always going to be a problem, right? There's always going to be bad actors. We're less concerned about does a bad actor exist, and more concerned about, do we have the right systems to catch the bad actor, prevent what the bad actor is doing, and remediate what the bad actor did, right? So we are really concerned with those systems in a different way than an individual instance. I hope that helps to answer your question. It's, you know, it's not a perfect solution, but I think that there's a lot of different factors that have to be taken into account to really solve this problem.
Thanks. So you guys have mentioned a couple of mechanisms, I guess, for delivery of these types of processes, like having a box in the factory you mentioned may not be so effective, or having an email address somewhere that isn't very accessible. Do you have any more advice and guidance kind of on these different methods of delivery, whether you would advise any to be particularly effective, and then also whether you feel that these methods need to be tailored to the particular local cultural context or country in which they're being enforced?
Sophie, you want to go for it?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, accessibility is the most important first step to making sure a system works. And accessibility also incorporates, do workers know about it? Is it easy for them to use, right? So the best thing we've seen for accessibility is sort of a combination of approaches, again, that are tailored to the context in which they operate. We get a lot of use out of just putting a QR code on the wall, to be honest. It's very simple and clean. You can have a poster that, in our experience, we've helped and worked with brands to design that is in the local language of workers, or at times a variety of languages to accommodate for minority language speakers as well. And a big flashy QR code in a place or a part of the factory that workers generally use actively. So that could be like near a bathroom or near a canteen, et cetera. And allowing workers to scan a QR code and respond has been a way we've gotten a lot of uptake. In other situations, we've used cards, which have name of a telephone number on it and an explanation. But whatever method we use, whatever physical method, needs to be accompanied by supplier managers really enforcing the system and making it public. So that's through meetings or through managers directly telling workers what it is and what it's used for, and what happens when you raise information or concerns through these systems. So again, it's that piece of information that's really key in terms of making a system accessible. We also, as you know, we operate in China or places where you need WeChat, and maybe a WeChat QR code or an number is more effective. So again, you can't, but using WeChat wouldn't make sense in South America, right? So you need to be able to tailor whatever system you use and communication to a local context. But the ultimate system, the backend that collects the data, can be the same regardless of context.
So what I would add is, really the most important piece of this whole thing is that the people who interface the most with the worker are the employers, right? And so the most important thing, be it before we even talk about like what tool they use and how it works and yada, 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 because there's lots of technologies out there, as Sophie has listed, we need to make sure that employers are incentivized to share that information with their workers, right? Because that part of it is really, it's like that's how these things don't end up not working, right? Because if the incentive structure is one in which I, as an employer, if I tell my workers about this helpline, then the workers can use that helpline to call my buyer and tell my buyer I'm a bad boss, which could then mean that I lose that order next year. And so my worker then loses their job. And so why would I promote it? And then again, why would I use it as a worker, right? These are, the incentive structure doesn't exist in these cases. And so to Sophie's point, the best way to localize it is, again, to work with suppliers, right? Or to work with direct employers, because there's tons of ways, as we all know, because we all exist in companies, and we, many of us have worked with supply chains. Every employer has a way of communicating with their workers, whether it be face-to-face, whether it be through WeChat, whether it be WhatsApp, or through posters and meetings and things like that. And so we really need to trust that they know the best way to do that. And we need to provide them with the tools to do it the best way, rather than kind of say, oh, it's in China, it's got to be on WeChat, right? We need to think about it a little bit more holistically. The other thing I would warn against is a lot of times we see people who really focus on like the 2% or the 5% of the population who doesn't have a phone. Well, I'm here to tell you, there will always be 2% of the population who will not be able to access something. You cannot be focused on the 2% and forget about the 98%, and forget to provide them with something that they need that's useful for them. And so I think we see that a lot with particularly with brands, actually, less than employers directly. Employers oftentimes kind of know that already and know the solutions. So try to pull out and look at the bigger picture.
Great, thank you. I'm also wondering, as much as you can share, what the data typically looks like. So within that wider umbrella of grievance, whatever it may be, are there typical themes or typical grievances, so to speak, that tend to be more commonly raised than others?
So, I mean, Phoebe, the way we approach it is we look at, we want to educate, connect, and engage workers. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that for any kind of buyer that we work with, any kind of brand that we work with, that we give them data points, one data point for each one of those things, for each of their suppliers, that really helps them understand what's happening in that supply chain, or what's happening in that supplier base. And so the number one most important thing that we think a brand or a buyer should be interested in is it used? Is there utilization that's coming out of your helpline? That's how we know that there's trust. That's how we know that workers know about it. That's how we know that management is doing something about it. So we often look at what are our leading indicators versus what are our driving indicators, right? So what gets us there? As a supplier or as an employer, I'm really concerned about all these things that are happening beneath it. But as a buyer, I'm really just trying to make sure that they're successful. So when I see that there's a low utilization score, or I see that people aren't using the e-learning, or I see that people wouldn't recommend this as a place of work to their friends or family members, these are things that now make me concerned. And then I might go and look at the deeper data and see things like, how quickly is a grievance handled, or what department is it coming from? But that's really like usually that work is really focused with the suppliers or the employers directly, and from a high level, because again, how do you scale this? Like, how could you possibly do this at scale if you're looking at all of that data? We're really trying to focus on those 3 data points for brands. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Sophie, was there anything you wanted to add?
Sure. Just one other point on that is to Elena's point of scale. I think it's very difficult for brands to directly collect grievances sort of ad hominem, because a lot of the ones that do come in are more banal things that employees just want to communicate with their employer, right? Like, where is the water fountain on floor 4, or the toilets aren't working again, et cetera. And those are things that not only shouldn't really be communicated through this type of line, but are impossible for major brands to handle or address at scale, because they're obviously so localized. So there's part of what Elena's approach and what she mentioned does is it filters out the kind of direct back and forth that can happen between a worker and their employer. So it allows brands to be able to focus on what really matters and the actual type of data that they need to show efficacy of a system. I'm not sure if that holds.
I think, one of the points that I would kind of leave with is that don't think of a grievance system as a way to solve all your problems, right? A grievance system is just going to help you understand where some of your problems may be, but it is not a solution to forced labor in and of itself, right? It is not a solution to corruption. It is not a solution to all these other things that are happening, and neither is this data. And so we need to make sure that we don't look at what seems to be easier or look at what's a low-hanging fruit and think that like just by doing one thing that we've done enough, right? And as you can see, like in the way that this process works and what we're talking about creates a good grievance system, there's a lot of pieces that are moving here to make it work. And these have to exist within environments that will set us up for success. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to think about grievance systems as the piece of the puzzle that they are, not as the entire picture.
Great. I was actually about to say we're coming to the end of the session, so any closing remarks, but Elena, you've just done an excellent job. I don't know if you guys wanted to add anything else just to finish, anything you'd like to say to the companies on the line before I close out.
I think just one more comment to Elena's point, and Phoebe, I'd also love to hear if you have any final thoughts for us as well, because yeah, I think it's a really important piece that we're tying in. This type of work is not coming out of nowhere, right? These new laws and ESG, all of that has kind of emerged over the past couple of years, but organizations like yours and ours, with Labor Solutions, have been working on this type of issue for a really long time. And so have many of you on this call. So it's about, what we're suggesting is about leveraging approaches that are already working and collaborating instead of sort of having one size fits all solutions or coming in with something new when we already have so much that we can build on. So it's really about using what we've had to move forward with Grievance. Those are my final thoughts. But yeah, Phoebe, I'd love to hear what else you have to say as well.
No, I mean, we're super excited to be collaborating with you guys. As you know, it's very much our mission to bring organizations together and develop new and innovative solutions to age-old problems. So we're very much looking forward to moving forward and working specifically on grievance with you guys. Definitely encourage those of you on the line who are members to get involved in this project, and those of you who aren't, maybe get in touch with the Mekong Club to learn more about our work. And I can see, Sophie, you've popped your email address there up on the screen too. So we have recorded this session, and we will be sending out the recording to everybody who is registered, along with our contact information. And I just thank you both so much for joining. That was a really, really interesting session. Hopefully the first of many in this space. There will be a survey when we close out the session for everybody on the line. Please, if you could complete it, it's really helpful for us to get any feedback and recommendations for future sessions. And with that, thank you, Elena and Sophie, once again, and thank you everybody on the line for joining.